The bass rattling the floorboards of the velvet claw was doing absolutely nothing for my escalating migraine. I hoisted Sarah's limp arm higher over my shoulder, ducking under the strobe lights as she narrowly avoided face-planting into a velvet rope. "Almost to the cab," I wheezed, practically dragging her past the VIP lounge. That's when the suit blocked our exit. He didn't look like the usual sweaty club rats. He was towering, suffocatingly tailored, and wore the deeply exhausted expression of a man calculating his taxes. When Sarah stumbled, pitching forward toward a low glass table, he moved with terrifying, silent speed. His massive hand shot out, reaching right for her waist. My defensive reflexes didn't check his intentions. They just took the wheel. "Don't," I shouted, pivoting on my heel and throwing my entire body weight behind my right fist. My knuckles collided directly with the sharpest, most aristocratic jawline I had ever seen. The sound it made was horrifying, a sickening hollow crack that somehow echoed over the deafening techno music. Pain exploded up my arm as he staggered back, his dark eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated shock. Before I could blink, 4 massive men materialized out of the shadows, shoving me against the nearest wall with terrifying force. The man in the suit waved them off with a single, trembling finger. He pressed a hand to his rapidly swelling face, spat a literal tooth onto the carpet, and tried to fix me with a menacing, authoritative glare. "Now," he slurred thickly, blood pooling in his cheek. "You're drunk." Oh God, I hadn't just punched a creep. I'd assaulted someone who owned the building. Chapter 1. The back office of the Velvet Claw smelled aggressively of stale espresso and bleach, a stark contrast to the expensive bad decisions lingering out on the dance floor. I was currently pinned to a faux leather sofa by the sheer, terrifying gravitational pull of 4 men who looked like they ate cinder blocks for breakfast. They hadn't actually touched me since dragging me in here, but the absolute predatory stillness in the room was suffocating. Across the glass desk sat the man I had just assaulted. He was no longer trying to look menacing. Instead, he was slumped in a plush, ergonomic chair, pressing a crinkling plastic bag of frozen, crinkle-cut carrots to his jaw. Up close, without the strobe lights, he was unreasonably striking. Sharp cheekbones, dark, exhausted eyes, and a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my college tuition. He also looked like he desperately wanted a nap. "Look, let's be perfectly rational about this," I started, my voice vibrating with a manic, highly defensive energy. Under state law, a perceived physical threat justifies proportional defensive force. You reached for Sarah. I reacted. It's classic tort law. If you try to press charges, my lawyer will completely dismantle you in court. I didn't have a lawyer. I had a premium music subscription, a dying succulent, and a crippling fear of vulnerability that I consistently masked with a very loud mouth. The man didn't flinch. He just stared at me over the bag of frozen carrots, his dark eyes entirely devoid of anger. Instead, there was a strange, morbid fascination in his steady gaze. He tapped a single long finger against the heavy desk. The largest guard, a guy with a neck thicker than my torso, leaned forward, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "You assaulted our leader, human. You don't get lawyers. You get a shallow hole in the woods." "A leader?" I let out a breathless, hysterical laugh, desperately trying to keep the panic from swallowing me whole. "What, like, of the tri-state area? Did I punch a feudal lord? Is this a medieval times franchise?" The guard snarled, stepping closer, completely eclipsing the harsh fluorescent light. My pulse hammered violently against my ribs. I braced myself, my practical brain screaming that sarcasm was a terrible defense mechanism against giant mobsters. But the injured man behind the desk simply raised his free hand. The guard froze instantly, stepping back like a reprimanded dog. The sheer, silent authority radiating from the man was heavy and absolute. He didn't need to yell, he just existed, and the room bent around him. He tapped his ear, and for the first time, I noticed a sleek earpiece tucked into his dark hair. His expression darkened, the exhaustion deepening into something profoundly grim. "The council is already moving," a a second guard whispered from the doorway, holding a burner phone. They heard a human laid hands on you. Vance is calling an emergency vote of no confidence. If you don't punish her severely, they'll strip your authority by midnight. They're saying you're weak. I swallowed hard, my defensive armor cracking. Strip your authority? Wait, I didn't mean to ruin your... whatever this is. The man ignored me. He dropped the frozen carrots, wincing as his bruised, slightly dislodged jaw shifted. He reached into the desk drawer, pulled out a small dry erase whiteboard, and uncapped a black marker. The room fell dead silent as the marker squeaked against the plastic. He flipped the board around, aiming it directly at his head of security. There was only one word written on it: courtship. Chapter 2. The word courtship hung in the sterile air of the club's back office like a live grenade. The head of security stared at the whiteboard, his heavy brow furrowing so deeply his eyes practically disappeared. Courtship? He choked out, staring at his boss as if the man had just suggested they all take up competitive knitting. Sir, she shattered your mandible. She is a human. The council will... The man behind the desk didn't write another word. He simply raised his dark eyes, fixing the guard with a look so entirely flat and devoid of warmth that the giant man actually took a half-step backward. The message was clear. Do not question me. 45 minutes later, I wasn't in a shallow grave in the woods. I was sitting in a glaringly bright, aggressively air-conditioned conference room at a 24-hour legal clinic downtown. The room smelled of expensive parchment, lemon polish, and centuries of bureaucratic oppression. Across the sprawling mahogany table sat 3 ancient men in tweed suits who looked like they had personally drafted the Magna Carta. And right beside me, close enough that I could smell the crisp, expensive bergamot of his cologne, sat the man whose jaw I had relocated to the left. His name, I had learned during the terrifying, silent SUV ride, was Silas. King Silas, technically, though he looked less like a king and more like a CEO who was 3 days behind on a massive corporate merger. The Lycan legal code is quite rigid regarding physical altercations with the ruling alpha, the oldest lawyer droned, pushing a heavy, gold-embossed document across the table. An unprovoked attack is punishable by... well, we needn't get into the visceral details. However, there is a singular loophole. I crossed my arms tightly over my chest, my fingernails digging into my own skin to keep my hands from shaking. And that would be? Section 4, paragraph 9. The lawyer sighed, as if reading it caused him physical pain. If the physical altercation is deemed a passionate, primal mating ritual between a king and his actively courting mate, it cannot be classified as assault. I stared at the wrinkled old man. I stared at the dense, terrifying contract. Then, I turned my head to look at Silas. He was holding a fresh, medical-grade ice pack to his cheek, completely silent. His dark eyes met mine, offering no apology, just the cold, hard calculus of survival. He needed this fake relationship to stop his political rivals from stealing his crown for showing weakness, and I needed it to stay out of a shifter prison. You want me to fake date the guy I just punched? I asked, my voice rising in pitch. I hit him so hard his teeth fell out. What kind of passionate mating ritual involves a right hook? Silas reached for his little whiteboard. He uncapped his marker, the squeak-squeak sound grating against the quiet room, and wrote, a spicy one. He turned the board toward me. I blinked. Was the terrifying mob king joking? I am not signing a blank check for my life, I snapped, trying to regain the upper hand. I dug into my purse, pulled out a red pen I used for grading middle school history papers, and aggressively pulled the contract toward me. If we are doing this, we are setting boundaries. The 3 ancient lawyers gasped in unison as I uncapped the red ink. Item 1, I declared, slashing a bright red line through a deeply disturbing paragraph. Absolutely no claiming bites. I don't know what that is, but it sounds like a hygiene violation. Item 2, if I have to deal with paparazzi, I want a per diem. My time is valuable. Item 3. I paused, realizing Silas was leaning closer to me. His solid shoulder brushed against mine, sending a startling, electric jolt down my arm. He wasn't stopping me. He was watching my red pen with profound, silent fascination. He tapped the whiteboard, writing a new message. "What is a per diem?" "An allowance," I muttered, crossing out a clause that mandated I wear his pack colors at all times. For the emotional distress of being seen with a man who gets punched by pedestrians. Silas didn't glare. A faint, painful-looking twitch pulled at the unbruised side of his mouth. It looked suspiciously like a smile. "Miss Margot," the lead lawyer interrupted, his voice trembling with archaic rage, "you cannot line edit a royal decree." "I just did," I shot back, sliding the bleeding red-marked document across the table. "Those are my terms. I keep my autonomy, I don't get bitten, and he gets to keep his little kingdom. Do we have a deal?" Silas didn't hesitate. He picked up a gold fountain pen and signed his name at the bottom of my butchered document. "Excellent," the lawyer spat, looking physically ill as he stamped the paper. "The courtship is legally binding for 6 months. To satisfy the council's immediate scrutiny, the cohabitation clause takes effect immediately. Tonight." My victorious smirk instantly evaporated. "Wait. The what clause?" "Cohabitation," the lawyer said, a cruel, satisfied smile stretching across his wrinkled face. "You don't get to go home, Miss Margot. You live with the king now." Chapter 3. By 2 a.m, I was dragging 2 heavily overstuffed, violently colorful duffel bags across the threshold of the most depressing piece of real estate I had ever seen. Silas's corporate penthouse was perched at the very top of a glass skyscraper overlooking the glittering skyline of the city. But inside, it was a monument to clinical depression. The floors were gray concrete. The walls were stark white. The furniture consisted of harsh, angular black leather that looked like it actively hated the human spine. There was not a single photograph, not a single plant, not even a rogue coffee mug left on the counter. "Did you hire a villain-themed interior decorator?" I asked, dropping my bright pink, floral-patterned duffel bag directly onto his pristine, custom-woven gray rug. "Or do you just naturally repel joy?" Silas stood by the kitchen island, his tall frame cutting a sharp, intimidating silhouette against the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was still wearing the trousers and vest of his ruined suit, his tie completely undone. He looked exhausted, rubbing the back of his neck before picking up his whiteboard. "It is highly functional." "It's a mausoleum," I corrected him, unzipping my bag. I began pulling out my chaotic life. A pair of fuzzy yellow socks, a heavily dented travel mug, a stack of paperback books, and a violently bright mustard yellow throw pillow I carried everywhere for back support. I tossed the yellow pillow onto his sad, angular black leather sofa. There. Now it looks like someone actually lives here, instead of just waiting to die. Silas stared at the yellow pillow as if it were a highly radioactive explosive. "Don't look at it like that," I huffed. I grabbed the pillow and chucked it directly at his chest. Catch. I hadn't accounted for the fact that he was a biologically enhanced shifter. His reflexes were terrifying. Before the pillow even crossed halfway to him, his hand shot out, snatching the fabric out of the air with a loud, aggressive smack. But the sudden, twisting motion was a mistake. Silas immediately squeezed his eyes shut, letting out a sharp, muted groan through his wired jaw as his bruised face throbbed. The pillow dropped to the floor. My sarcastic armor instantly cracked. "Oh, God, I'm sorry. I forgot you were fragile." He opened his eyes, glaring at me so fiercely the air in the room felt heavy. He walked over, picked up the yellow pillow, and meticulously placed it on the black leather couch. He then pointed to a long, empty hallway, grabbed his whiteboard, and wrote, "First door on the left." It was a dismissal. Clear and absolute. I didn't argue. I dragged my bags into the massive, sterile guest room, shut the heavy oak door, and collapsed onto the mattress. The reality of the night finally crushed the air from my lungs. I was a hostage to a fake contract, trapped in the penthouse of a man I had hospitalized, completely cut off from the small, safe, logical life I had meticulously built. I don't know how long I lay there staring at the ceiling, but my throat eventually felt like sandpaper. I needed water. I slipped out of the room, padding softly down the dark hallway in my socks. The penthouse was entirely silent save for the faint, low hum of the city traffic hundreds of feet below. As I neared the massive open-concept living room, I stopped dead in my tracks. Silas hadn't gone to sleep. He was sitting on the floor, avoiding his terrible couch entirely, leaning his broad back against the floor-to-ceiling window. The only light in the cavernous room came from the harsh blue glow of the tablet in his lap. He wasn't acting like a terrifying alpha king. He just looked like a man drowning. He was scrolling through what looked like an endless stream of political emails, his uninjured hand rubbing his temples in a rhythmic, desperate circle. The heavy, suffocating weight of his responsibilities was practically visible in the slump of his shoulders. I stood in the shadows, my breath catching in my throat. I had spent my entire life building walls, using sarcasm and physical reflexes to keep people away because caring about people always led to being left behind. But watching the absolute, crushing loneliness radiating from this terrifying man, something in my chest shifted. His phone buzzed on the floor next to him. A text notification lit up the screen, large enough for me to read from the hallway. Lord Sterling's faction is demanding proof of the mating bond by tomorrow. They are coming for your seat, Silas. You're out of time. Silas stared at the message. He didn't punch the glass. He didn't roar. He just let his head fall back against the cold window pane, closing his eyes in total defeat. The next night, our passionate mating ritual brought us to a place that smelled exclusively of old fryer grease and desperation. "You have got to be kidding me," Silas's head of security muttered into his earpiece, scanning the sticky, fluorescent-lit downtown diner. "Sir, the perimeter is compromised by at least 3 health code violations." Silas waved the massive guard out the door, forcing him to stand on the rainy sidewalk. We slid into a cracked red vinyl booth near the back. The stark contrast between us was painfully hilarious. I was wearing my favorite oversized flannel shirt and ripped jeans. Silas was wearing a bespoke navy blue suit that probably cost more than the entire restaurant. He looked entirely too large for the booth, his broad shoulders practically spilling into the aisle. "Lord Sterling's spies have been tailing us since we left the building," I murmured, leaning across the sticky Formica table. "If we want to prove we are deeply in love, we have to look like we actually enjoy each other's company. Stop glaring at the salt shaker." Silas couldn't speak, his jaw still heavily wired and bruised. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out his phone, and aggressively typed a message, sliding it across the table to me. "This table is coated in a mysterious adhesive. I am plotting its destruction." I laughed, a genuine loud sound that startled the tired waitress walking by. "That's character building," I told him. "You need to experience how the other half lives, Your Majesty." The waitress arrived, popping her gum. I ordered a massive plate of loaded chili cheese fries, a vanilla milkshake, and a side of onion rings. Silas, restricted by his medical state, ordered a bowl of lukewarm chicken broth and a plastic straw. When the food arrived, the power imbalance shifted entirely in my favor. I aggressively dipped a perfectly fried, crispy onion ring into an obscene amount of ranch dressing. I leaned forward, holding it right in front of Silas's face. "Listen to this crunch," I whispered, maintaining intense, unblinking eye contact. I bit into it. The sound echoed in the quiet diner. Silas narrowed his eyes, his nostrils flaring slightly. He aggressively stabbed his plastic straw into his bowl of sad, clear broth and took a slow, agonizing sip. He typed on his phone and shoved it at me. "You are a monster. When my jaw heals, I am going to buy this establishment and burn it to the ground." "That's not very romantic," I teased, stealing a chili cheese fry. "You're supposed to be courting me, remember? Look at me with deep primal affection." Silas crossed his massive arms over his chest. He leaned back in the vinyl booth, tilting his head slightly. The harsh, flickering fluorescent light caught the sharp angles of his face. Slowly, the irritation in his dark eyes melted into something entirely different. He held my gaze, unblinking, his focus entirely singular. The air between us suddenly felt incredibly thick, the noise of the diner fading into a distant, muffled hum. My breath hitched. The fry hovered halfway to my mouth. He wasn't glaring anymore. He was looking at me, really looking at me. And the sheer, undeniable weight of his attention sent a hot, terrifying flush straight up my neck. Snap. A blinding burst of white light exploded through the diner window right beside my head. I flinched violently, crying out as the sudden flash blinded me. Before I could even register what was happening, the diner booth shifted. Silas moved with a terrifying, explosive speed. He didn't just stand up, he lunged over the table. His solid, heavy frame crashed against mine, shoving me completely into the corner of the booth. He planted his back to the glass window, physically shielding my body with his own. The camera flashed again, but all it captured was the broad expanse of Silas's tailored suit. I was pressed flush against the cracked vinyl, entirely caged in by his sheer size. My hands were trapped flat against his chest, and I could feel the rapid, heavy thumping of his heart beneath his dress shirt. His face was inches from mine, his eyes scanning the diner with a ferocious, predatory intensity. "Silas!" I breathed, my voice trembling. He looked down at me, his chest rising and falling heavily against mine. The physical proximity was overwhelming. He wasn't using any magic, and he wasn't pulling some weird alpha dominance act. He was just a man using his own body to block a threat, his biological instincts completely overriding his logical, bureaucratic brain. The paparazzi scrambled away down the rainy street, chased off by the security team outside. But Silas didn't move away. He stayed pressed against me in the cramped booth, his dark eyes searching my face, checking for any sign of panic. His large hand tentatively moved, his thumb brushing against my shoulder to steady me. I stared up at the man whose jaw I had broken, my cynical, fiercely independent heart doing a terrifying, complicated backflip. I had spent my entire life taking care of myself, but caged in this dirty diner booth, completely surrounded by him. I realized, with a heavy sense of impending doom, that I felt absolutely, perfectly safe. The suffocating, hyper-protective proximity of the diner booth completely ruined my sleep schedule. Every time I closed my eyes in the sterile guest room of the penthouse, all I could feel was the heavy, solid weight of Silas shielding me from the camera flash. It was a terrifying realization. I, Margot, the fiercely independent cynic, had genuinely liked being protected. By 9 the next morning, I was severely undercaffeinated and deeply agitated. We were currently standing in the Daily Grind, a violently cheerful, aggressively hipster coffee shop situated in the Arts District. The air smelled of roasted beans, eucalyptus, and pretentious indie folk music. Silas, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal trench coat, looked like a mafia hitman who had accidentally wandered into a millennial petting zoo. "I will handle this," Silas typed on his phone, showing me the screen with a stiff, determined posture. "I can procure basic human sustenance. Stay here." He was trying to simulate normal boyfriend behavior for the benefit of the council spies supposedly watching us. I crossed my arms, leaning against an exposed brick column, and watched him march up to the counter. The barista was a severely bored teenager with a septum piercing, a bleached mullet, and an oversized vintage band t-shirt. He did not look up from his phone when the towering, intimidating ruler of the Regional Shifter Coalition approached the register. "Welcome to the grind," the kid droned, popping a bubble of pink gum. "What's your journey today?" Silas blinked. He stared at the teenager, then at the massive, chaotic chalkboard menu written entirely in unreadable cursive. I could practically see his hyper-logical, bureaucratic brain short-circuiting. "I require," Silas rasped, his voice raw and heavily strained from the wired jaw. He cleared his throat, wincing. "Coffee." "Cool," the kid sighed, finally looking up. He paused for a fraction of a second, registering Silas's deeply bruised face and absolute lack of chill, before shrugging. "Drip? Pour over? Nitro cold brew? Americano? We got single origin Ethiopian or the house blend. Silas stood perfectly rigid. His dark eyes darted across the menu. The standard one, for her, and a tea. Right. Milk? Silas gave a sharp single nod. Yes. Which one, man? The kid leaned against the espresso machine. We have whole, skim, 2%, oat, almond, soy, macadamia, cashew, and coconut. The cashew costs extra, but it's ethically sourced. A terrifying, absolute silence descended upon the counter. Silas narrowed his eyes, delivering a cold, dead-eyed stare that I knew for a fact usually made seasoned political rivals sweat through their expensive suits. It was the stare of a man who governed a secret society. The teenager simply popped another gum bubble. Dude, I make $15 an hour. You can glare at me all day, but I still need to know if you want the nut milk or the oat milk. The sheer, absurd comedy of the situation broke my anxiety. Silas wasn't an invincible, brooding overlord. He was just a chronically exhausted guy who had absolutely no idea how to function outside of a boardroom. I stepped up beside him, gently bumping my shoulder against his rigid arm. He'll take a black Earl Grey tea, I told the barista, swiping my credit card before Silas could even reach for his wallet. And I need a massive iced Americano with 2 pumps of vanilla and oat milk. Keep the change. The kid nodded, printing the receipt. Silas turned his head slowly. He didn't look annoyed that I had interrupted, nor did he look emasculated that I had paid. He simply looked down at me, the harsh, fluorescent overhead lights catching the deep, profound, and utterly silent awe in his dark eyes. It was the look of a man who had just watched someone perform a miracle. The Royal Botanical Conservatory was a sprawling, humid glasshouse filled with rare orchids, towering ferns, and the suffocating scent of extreme wealth. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the geometric glass ceiling, casting long, fractured shadows across the marble floors. This was our first public foray into shifter high society. I was wearing a sleek, emerald green dress that Silas's administrative assistant had express delivered to the penthouse. Silas wore a bespoke gray suit, his posture impeccably straight, though I could feel the faint, rhythmic tension radiating through the fabric of his sleeve where my hand rested. Just smile and look bored, I whispered out of the corner of my mouth as we navigated a gauntlet of glittering, hostile-looking socialites holding champagne flutes. Rich people love it when you look like you'd rather be anywhere else. It establishes dominance. Silas didn't speak, but his thumb brushed rhythmically against the inside of my wrist, a small grounding anchor in a sea of predators. We almost made it to the secluded fern pavilion when a voice, dripping with theatrical condescension, echoed behind us. Silas, I am genuinely shocked you had the fortitude to leave your bunker. We turned. Approaching us was a man dressed like a Victorian villain who had discovered modern tailoring. He had slicked back blonde hair, a sharp nose, and a deeply punchable smirk. This, I deduced instantly, was Lord Vance, the political rival actively trying to steal Silas's job. And this? Vance purred, his pale eyes dragging over me with blatant, calculated disrespect, must be the passionate mate. I must admit, Silas, when I heard the rumors, I assumed the council was exaggerating. But relying on a fragile little human for political theater? Your desperation is showing. Silas's entire body went rigid. The diplomatic bureaucrat vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying stillness. He reached for his phone, preparing to type a furious, legally binding threat. I didn't let him. I took a half step forward, smoothly placing myself slightly between Silas and Vance. I plastered on the most devastatingly polite, vacant smile I had perfected during my years in corporate administration. You must be Lord Vance, I said, my voice entirely even, devoid of any fear. Silas has mentioned you, though honestly I pictured someone taller. Vance's smirk faltered. Several nearby socialites went completely silent, their champagne flutes hovering near their mouths. I beg your pardon, Vance clipped, his posture stiffening. I'm just observing, I continued, tilting my head like I was examining a mildly interesting bug. It's so fascinating how the council operates. You spend so much energy worrying about Silas's personal life, one has to wonder who is managing your portfolio. From what I've read of the quarterly coalition reports, your sector's yield is down 12%. But please tell me more about my dress. You clearly have an abundance of free time. The silence in the conservatory was absolute. Vance's face cycled through shock, outrage, and finally, a mottled, furious red. He opened his mouth to retort, but found absolutely nothing to say that wouldn't make him look like a petulant child. "Excuse us," I said, offering a crisp, dismissive nod. "Silas needs his tea. It was aggressively mediocre meeting you." I tugged on Silas's arm, steering him away from the sputtering lord and into the quiet sanctuary of the fern pavilion. My heart was hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs, but I kept my chin high. As soon as we were out of sight, Silas stopped walking. I looked up, expecting him to reprimand me for ruining a diplomatic interaction. Instead, he pulled out his phone, his large thumbs flying rapidly across the screen. He turned the device toward me. "Remind me never to make you angry." A small, breathless laugh escaped my lips. Silas wasn't glaring. The edges of his eyes crinkled with genuine, unadulterated amusement. The political tension evaporated, replaced instantly by a heavy electric pull that made the humid air of the greenhouse feel suddenly difficult to breathe. The interior of Silas's luxury SUV was a masterclass in sensory deprivation. The tinted windows completely blocked out the frantic neon lights of the city traffic, and the soundproofing was so absolute it felt like riding inside a leather-lined vault. We were sitting on opposite ends of the spacious back seat. Exhaustion hung heavy in the dark space between us. The botanical garden had been a massive success, but the adrenaline crash had left me drained, my head resting heavily against the cool glass of the window. Silas couldn't speak without intense pain, and I didn't have the energy to fill the silence with my usual sarcastic babble. My phone buzzed in my clutch. I pulled it out, squinting against the harsh screen brightness. A text message from an unknown number. Unknown. Vance looked as though he had swallowed a live wasp. I glanced across the dark seat. Silas was staring straight ahead, the faint blue glow of his phone illuminating the sharp, bruised angle of his jaw. I saved his number as the bureaucrat and typed back. "Me. He had it coming. You were going to let him monologue. I have a strict anti-monologue policy." My phone buzzed almost instantly. The bureaucrat. I am accustomed to ignoring him. It is a necessary diplomatic tactic. However, I have never had anyone intervene on my behalf before. I stared at the screen, the cursor blinking rapidly. The physical distance between us and the massive car suddenly felt incredibly small. The digital barrier was stripping away our usual defenses. In person, we hid behind glares and fast-talking humor. In the quiet dark of the text thread, the truth was slipping out. Me. Don't get used to it. I charge an exorbitant hourly rate for bodyguard services. The bureaucrat. Worth every penny. I bit the inside of my cheek, a hot, terrifying flutter erupting in my stomach. The silence in the car stretched, underscored only by the faint, rhythmic thumping of the tires over the asphalt. I could hear Silas breathing. Slow, measured, steady. I could smell his cologne, bergamot and cedar, mixing with the faint ozone scent of the city rain outside. My phone vibrated again. The bureaucrat. You are very skilled at keeping people off balance. The sarcasm, the legal threats, the perfectly timed insults. It is highly effective armor. I swallowed hard, my thumb hovering over the digital keyboard. He was reading me far too accurately. Me. It keeps the weirdos away. The bureaucrat. Does it? Or does it just keep everyone away? I squeezed my eyes shut, my pulse spiking into a frantic, defensive rhythm. The playful banter had vanished, replaced by a surgical strike directly at my deepest, most pathetic insecurity. Me. Are you trying to psychoanalyze me via iMessage? Because I can punch your other jaw. The silence dragged on for 2 full minutes. I thought I had successfully shut him down. I thought the wall was back in place. But then the screen lit up with 3 simple, devastating words. The bureaucrat. Why are you so terrified of being seen, Margot? I stared at the glowing letters, my lungs refusing to expand. I looked across the dark back seat. Silas had turned his head. He was watching me through the shadows, his expression completely unguarded, waiting for an answer I was absolutely terrified to give. I didn't answer the text message. I had stared at the glowing screen in the dark of the SUV until my eyes burned, and then I had simply locked my phone and turned my head to watch the rain slide down the window. The next afternoon, the digital silence between us was deafening. We were currently navigating the claustrophobic aisles of the downtown indoor farmers market. It was a chaotic, sensory overload of a place, smelling intensely of artisan cheese wheels, damp earth, and crushed lavender. Silas, dressed in a sharp slate-gray overcoat, looked entirely out of place among the canvas tote bags and organic root vegetables. He moved through the throngs of people with a practiced, rigid grace, his height allowing him to completely ignore the bustling crowds. I was aggressively inspecting a bin of wildly overpriced heirloom tomatoes when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. The bureaucrat. You are ignoring the question. I looked up. Silas was standing 3 feet away, holding a perfectly round, bright yellow squash with absolute, uncomprehending bewilderment. He didn't look at me, but his thumb was resting over the screen of his phone. Me. There is no question. I'm just trying to buy tomatoes without being psychoanalyzed. My phone buzzed again immediately. The bureaucrat. Deflection. Again. You use humor to build walls. The moment the conversation shifts to anything genuine, you retreat. A hot, prickly wave of defensive panic flushed up my neck. The air in the market suddenly felt too thick, smelling overwhelmingly of raw garlic and wet canvas. I shoved my phone into my pocket and marched up to him. Stop texting me, I hissed, keeping my voice low so the nearby vendor wouldn't hear. We have a contract to fake a courtship so you don't lose your job. That doesn't mean you get an all-access pass to my psychological profile. Silas carefully set the yellow squash down. He pulled his phone out, typed rapidly, and held the screen up. I am not your enemy, Margot. You do not need to fight me. I'm not fighting you, I snapped, my voice cracking slightly. The walls were entirely breached, and the sheer vulnerability made me feel cornered. You think because you read a few texts you understand how I operate? You don't know anything about me. You're just a bureaucrat clinging to a political title because a human managed to knock your teeth out. The words hung in the humid air between us, razor-sharp and deeply cruel. I waited for the anger. I waited for the terrifying, commanding presence he had used on his security guards. It never came. Silas just stared at me. The faint, persistent lines of exhaustion around his eyes seemed to deepen into something hollow and profoundly sad. He didn't look like an alpha, or a king, or a threat. He just looked like a man who was incredibly, bone-wearily tired of trying. He slowly lowered his phone. He didn't type a response. He simply turned around, his broad shoulders slumping under the tailored wool coat, and walked away into the dense crowd. I stood completely alone in the middle of the market, the crushing weight of what I had just done sinking like a stone in my chest. My original apartment was exactly how I had left it, cramped, chaotic, and smelling faintly of old paper and cheap vanilla candles. I had fled the sterile penthouse and retreated to my own space, wrapping myself in an oversized sweater and violently regretting every word I had spoken at the market. At 7 in the evening, the floorboards outside my door creaked heavily. I froze. A sharp, singular knock echoed through the tiny hallway. When I pulled the door open, my breath hitched. Silas was standing in the dimly lit corridor. He wasn't wearing a bespoke suit or a trench coat. He was wearing a plain, slightly faded gray Henley and dark jeans. He had no security detail, no earpiece, and, most surprisingly, he was holding a violently yellow plastic toolbox. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped past me, completely dwarfing my tiny entryway, and walked straight into the living room. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Silas set the toolbox down on my battered coffee table. He walked over to the living room window, the one I had complained about being jammed shut 3 days ago in passing. He pulled a standard Phillips head screwdriver from the yellow box and approached the rusted latch. I stood utterly paralyzed in the kitchen doorway. The king of the regional shifter coalition, a man who commanded hundreds and dictated corporate law, was currently wedging a cheap screwdriver into a rusted window track. He clamped his large hand over the wooden frame, his muscles straining against the cotton of his shirt as he tried to pry the mechanism upward. It was a complete disaster. The screwdriver slipped. Silas stumbled slightly, catching his balance against the wall. He let out a sharp, muted breath through his nose, glaring at the window latch with the exact same terrifying intensity he had used on the barista. He adjusted his grip, practically wrestling with the cheap aluminum frame, looking entirely awkward and completely out of his element. The sheer, ridiculous reality of the situation shattered the ice in my chest. A small, breathless laugh escaped my lips. "Silas, stop. You're going to break the glass." He froze, his broad back facing me. He slowly turned around, the screwdriver still tightly gripped in his hand. He looked frustrated, his hair slightly disheveled. I took a step forward, the floorboards groaning under my socks. "I am sorry," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. I was terrified. I push people away before they can realize I'm not worth staying for. I used your injury as a weapon, and it was a cheap, cruel shot. You didn't deserve it. Silas held my gaze for a long, heavy moment. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to choke on. Then, very slowly, he raised his free hand and tapped his bruised jaw. He looked at his fingers, then looked down at the cheap Phillips head screwdriver in his other hand. He raised a single dark eyebrow at me in a silent, deadpan question. "Are you sure I didn't deserve it?" A genuine, loud laugh burst out of me, echoing in the cramped apartment. Silas's shoulders finally dropped, the exhausted tension leaving his frame entirely as the corners of his eyes crinkled into a soft, quiet smile. The back room of Henri's bespoke tailoring was hushed, windowless, and draped in heavy, dark velvet. The air smelled intensely of brass polish, chalk dust, and the rich, earthy scent of raw wool. It had been 24 hours since the incident with the window, and the hostility between us had completely evaporated, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous. Silas was standing on a low wooden pedestal, staring straight ahead at a floor-to-ceiling mirror. He was dressed in a crisp white cotton dress shirt and tailored black trousers. Henri, a frantic, highly caffeinated man with a tape measure draped around his neck like a scarf, was currently vibrating with anxiety. "No, no, no! The silk backing is all wrong!" Henri gasped, dropping a box of pins onto a velvet ottoman. "I must retrieve the obsidian weave from the vault. Do not move, Your Majesty." Henri sprinted out of the fitting room, the heavy velvet curtains swishing shut behind him. The sudden silence in the room was absolute. "He left the collar unpinned," Silas noted, picking up his phone from a nearby side table. He typed a quick message and held it out to me. "I am trapped on this wooden box. I require assistance." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly very dry. "You want me to pin it?" Silas gave a single, slow nod. I walked over to the velvet ottoman, picked up 2 silver pins, and approached the pedestal. Because he was elevated, his chest was perfectly level with my eyes. I stepped closer, my sneakers squeaking faintly on the hardwood floor. The physical proximity hit me like a freight train. There was no magical aura or unnatural body heat, just the sheer, overwhelming reality of his physical presence. I could feel the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest. I could smell the clean, sharp scent of his bergamot cologne mixed with the faint starch of the new shirt. "Don't move," I breathed, my hands trembling slightly as I reached up to pinch the collar fabric near his throat. Silas didn't look at the mirror. He looked down at me. My knuckles brushed against the warm skin of his neck. His pulse jumped, hammering a rapid, heavy beat against my fingers. I froze, my eyes snapping up to meet his. His dark eyes were entirely dilated, completely devoid of the tired bureaucrat. His large hand moved, slowly and deliberately, coming to rest heavily on the curve of my waist to steady me. The touch burned right through the fabric of my dress. The air in the tiny, velvet-draped room was suddenly suffocatingly thick, thick enough to drown in. Silas leaned down. His face was inches from mine, his cheek brushing against my temple. I stopped breathing entirely. His lips grazed the very edge of my ear as he spoke his first clear, unslurred word since the night I broke his jaw. Margot? The vibration of my name rumbling against my ear completely short-circuited my brain. My fingers went numb, dropping the silver pin directly onto the hardwood floor with a sharp tink. Before I could even process the heavy, intoxicating gravity of his fully healed voice, the velvet curtains violently swished open. "I have the obsidian silk," Henri gasped, bursting into the room. Silas stepped back instantly, his hand dropping from my waist, but his dark eyes never left mine. The air in the room remained charged, humming with an entirely new, terrifying frequency. 48 hours later, that same frequency was vibrating beneath the polished marble floors of the National Antiquities Museum. The charity gala was a glittering, sensory assault of diamond chandeliers, string quartets, and the overwhelming perfume of the shifter elite. I stood at the edge of a massive dinosaur exhibit, wearing the emerald dress, perfectly playing my part. Silas was a formidable shadow beside me in his bespoke obsidian suit, his posture impeccably relaxed. We moved as an impenetrable unit, effortlessly sidestepping thinly veiled political interrogations with a synchronized rhythm of his stoic nods and my polite, devastating sarcasm. "You are enjoying this," Silas murmured, his voice a low, resonant baritone that sent a fresh shiver down my spine. He leaned closer, pretending to examine a triceratops skull. "You just dismantled Lord Sterling's tax policy using only 3 sentences and a smile." "I thrive on administrative warfare," I whispered back, accepting a flute of champagne from a passing waiter. "Plus, they keep underestimating me because I'm human. It's like shooting fish in a very expensive barrel." Silas's lips curved into a genuine, breathtaking smirk. "Remind me to put you on the payroll." "Sir," the head of security interrupted, stepping out from behind a limestone pillar. "The High Emissary requires your signature on the silent auction ledger." Silas glanced at me, reluctant to leave my side. "Go," I urged, giving his arm a gentle, reassuring squeeze. "I'll just stand here and judge the hors d'oeuvres." He nodded, disappearing into the sea of silk and velvet. I took a slow sip of my champagne, finally letting my shoulders drop. We were doing it. The charade was flawless. "A stunning performance, my dear." The voice slithered over my shoulder like ice water. I stiffened, turning slowly to find Lord Vance stepping out from the shadows of the exhibit. He wasn't holding a drink. He was holding a folded piece of thick, watermarked paper. "Lord Vance," I said, my voice perfectly even, "did you lose your way to the coat check?" "I prefer to skip the pleasantries," Vance purred, stopping inches from me. He didn't blink. He just slid the folded paper onto the display case next to my hand. I glanced down. It was a photocopy. My eyes locked onto the bottom of the page, where a bright red slash of ink crossed out a clause, sitting right above my own signature. It was the fake dating contract. "You're a clever little human," Vance whispered, his pale eyes gleaming with absolute malice. "But the council will not be mocked by a bureaucratic loophole. Enjoy your final hour in our world." Across the ballroom, Silas suddenly stopped walking. Even from 100 feet away, his head snapped toward me, his dark eyes locking onto mine through the crowd, instantly sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. The heavy, brass-handled doors to the museum rooftop slammed shut behind me, completely cutting off the suffocating classical music. The night air was freezing, whipping my hair across my face as I stumbled toward the stone parapet. Below me, the city lights blurred into a panicked neon smear. My chest heaved. I gripped the cold stone ledge, my mind racing through a dozen catastrophic scenarios. Vance had the contract. The loophole was exposed. Silas was going to lose his entire kingdom, and it was entirely my fault for being careless. The heavy doors groaned open. I didn't turn around. I could feel the sheer, imposing weight of his presence stepping onto the gravel roof. The quiet crunch of his leather shoes approached, stopping right beside me. "Vance has it," I blurted out, my voice cracking wildly in the wind. I stared down at the traffic, my fingernails digging desperately into the stone. "He has the contract, Silas. A photocopy with my red ink. I don't know how he bypassed your security, but it's over. They're going to call a vote. We need to formulate a legal defense, or maybe claim forgery, or... Margot." His voice wasn't rushed. It was entirely, devastatingly calm. "No, you aren't listening." I spun around, my hands flying up in a frantic, defensive gesture. "He is going to destroy everything you've built. Your crown, your coalition, your entire..." Silas caught my wrists. His grip was firm but impossibly gentle, pulling my hands away from the air and pressing them flat against the warm, solid expanse of his chest. His heart was hammering, not with fear, but with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. "I don't care about the crown," Silas said, stepping directly into my space. The wind whipped his dark hair, but his eyes were anchored entirely on mine, burning with an intensity that made my knees feel like water. "You have to care," I whispered, a terrifying pressure building in my throat. "It's your life." "My life," Silas murmured, his thumbs slowly brushing the frantic pulse at my wrists, "was an endless, suffocating series of rooms where everyone wanted something from me. Until you." He dropped my wrists, bringing his large hands up to cradle my face. The heat of his palms against my freezing skin sent a violent shudder through my entire body. "You didn't want my title," he breathed, leaning in until the crisp scent of bergamot completely enveloped me. "You wanted per diems and boundaries, and for me to catch a yellow pillow. You looked at a king and treated him like a man. I am not letting you go back to your quiet, lonely apartment." My sarcastic armor shattered into dust. There were no jokes left, no deflections. "Silas?" I gasped, my eyes fluttering shut as the sheer weight of his vulnerability completely unmade me. He didn't hesitate anymore. He closed the final inch between us. The kiss wasn't a tentative, polite question. It was desperate, consuming, and fiercely absolute. His mouth moved against mine with a starved intensity, his fingers tangling deep into my hair to anchor me against him. I let out a soft, breathless sound, my hands sliding up the lapels of his suit to grip his shoulders as the world below us entirely ceased to exist. I was falling, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care if I hit the ground. The morning sun slicing through the penthouse windows was obnoxiously bright, completely devoid of the romantic, forgiving shadows of the museum rooftop. I stood perfectly rigid at the kitchen island, staring blindly into a mug of black coffee. My lips still felt bruised. My skin was still humming with the phantom echo of his hands, but the adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a cold, paralyzing terror that had settled deep in my bones. I had let my guard down. I had given someone the power to completely destroy me. The quiet pad of footsteps sounded on the concrete floor. Silas walked into the kitchen, wearing gray sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt. He looked rested for the first time since I'd met him, a quiet, cautious hope radiating from his relaxed posture. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that instantly made my heart betray me with a frantic stutter. I gripped the ceramic mug so tightly my knuckles turned white. My survival instincts, the ones that had kept me safe for 26 years, screamed at me to rebuild the wall before he could realize what a chaotic, broken mess I actually was. "We need to talk about last night," I stated, my tone so violently clinical it sounded like I was reading a medical chart. Silas stopped walking. The cautious hope in his eyes flickered. "All right?" I didn't look at him. I couldn't. I stared at the stainless steel refrigerator instead. It was a stress response. The adrenaline from Vance confronting me, the fear of the political fallout. It triggered an acute physiological reaction. Classic fight-or-flight misfiring into misplaced intimacy. It wasn't real. The silence that stretched across the kitchen was agonizing. It wasn't the heavy, charged silence of the tailor's shop. It was the hollow, echoing silence of a tomb. "A stress response," Silas repeated slowly. Every syllable was perfectly measured, completely stripped of emotion. "Exactly," I rambled, my voice gaining speed as the panic pushed me forward. "It was highly unprofessional. We have a contract to manage. We need to focus on damage control regarding the leaked documents, not complicating things with emotional anomalies." I finally forced myself to look at him, praying he would argue, praying he would push past my ridiculous logic and tell me I was being an idiot. But Silas just stood there. The soft, unguarded man from the rooftop was entirely gone, replaced by the rigid, untouchable Alpha King. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, devastatingly hollow. "I understand," Silas said smoothly, his voice dropping in temperature until it was freezing. My chest tightened painfully. "You do? You made your boundaries exceptionally clear in the legal clinic, Margot," he replied, stepping back. He didn't cross his arms or glare. He simply looked at me like I was a stranger he had bumped into on the street. "I will not force you to be brave. If you require this to be nothing more than a bureaucratic arrangement, I will respect that parameter." He turned around and walked out of the kitchen without another word. I stood utterly alone in the harsh morning light, my heart shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. I had successfully rebuilt my walls and locked myself inside. The ride to the Shifter Council headquarters was a masterclass in suffocating, atmospheric horror. The luxury SUV, usually a sanctuary of heated seats and sarcastic texting, felt like a high-speed hearse. Silas sat entirely flush against the opposite door, staring out at the gray, weeping skyline. He hadn't spoken a single word since the kitchen. I sat with my hands wedged rigidly under my thighs to keep them from shaking. My practical, logical brain was frantically constructing a legal defense. I just needed to explain the red ink. I could claim I was practicing my calligraphy. I could claim temporary insanity. We arrived at a towering, brutalist concrete structure that looked less like a government building and more like a supervillain's parking garage. The council boardroom was entirely devoid of windows. It smelled intensely of old cedar, ozone, and predatory anticipation. A massive, circular mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by a dozen stone-faced council members. Lord Vance sat at the 12 o'clock position, looking like the cat who had not only eaten the canary but had also audited the canary's taxes. "Silas," Vance purred, steepling his fingers. "And the human. How punctual." "Skip the theatrical pacing, Vance," Silas said, pulling out a chair. He didn't sit. He stood behind it, resting his massive hands on the leather back. He looked completely, devastatingly exhausted. "You called the emergency session? State your grievance so I can get back to actually running this coalition." Vance smiled, a thin, reptilian stretch of lips. He tapped a glass screen on the table, and a holographic projection of our heavily red-lined courtship contract illuminated the center of the room. "My grievance is fraud," Vance announced, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You allowed a human to lay hands on a sitting king, and rather than enforce our laws, you fabricated a mating ritual. This contract proves you are compromised. The penalty for defrauding the High Council is the immediate stripping of your title, your assets, and the permanent exile of your co-conspirator." Permanent exile. A cold spike of adrenaline pierced my stomach. They were going to throw me into a shifter prison. I stepped forward, my fight-or-flight response choosing violence via litigation. "Point of order," I announced. my voice slicing through the heavy, hostile air. If you actually read the document, you will see that clause 4 in silence, human, a councilwoman snapped, baring her teeth. No, I will not silence, I shot back, gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard my joints popped. Under standard contract law, a document is only legally binding if both parties demonstrate intent. The red ink clearly signifies a draft state. You have stolen an incomplete administrative document. Frankly, we should be discussing your blatant violation of privacy laws and corporate espionage. Vance laughed. It was a dry, scraping sound. She is highly amusing, Silas. I see why you kept her around as a pet. But shifter law supersedes human technicalities. You have one option, Silas. Publicly denounce this woman, admit she manipulated you, authorize her immediate detainment, and we will allow you to step down with a shred of your dignity. My heart stopped. I looked at Silas. He was staring at the holographic projection of my messy handwriting. He didn't look at me. The physical proximity between us, separated only by 2 feet of polished wood, felt like a yawning, bottomless chasm. I could feel the heat radiating off his broad shoulders, could smell the sharp, metallic tang of his adrenaline masking his bergamot cologne. Denounce her, Vance repeated softly. Silas slowly lifted his head. The exhaustion vanished, replaced by an icy, terrifying authority that sucked all the oxygen out of the room. I will do no such thing, Silas said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble that literally vibrated the floorboards beneath my sneakers. He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a thick, embossed envelope, and tossed it onto the center of the table. It slid to a halt perfectly in front of Vance. That is a formal decree of dissolution, Silas stated, his eyes locking onto his rival. Drafted and signed by me, dated for this morning. The courtship contract is officially void. Miss Margot is no longer under my jurisdiction, nor is she affiliated with this pack, this council, or my personal estate. I stopped breathing. Silas, what are you doing? Furthermore, Silas continued, speaking over me, his voice entirely dead of emotion. As the contract was voided prior to this hearing, she is a civilian. Any attempt to detain, exile, or harass her will be an act of war against the human sector, which I will personally fund the litigation for. You have no legal hold on her. Vance's face darkened. You are shielding her. If you dissolve the bond, you have no defense for the physical assault. You forfeit the crown. Silas finally looked at me. His dark eyes were bottomless, stripped of all the warmth, all the humor, and all the desperate yearning from the rooftop. He was locking the door from the inside to keep the monsters away from me. I forfeit, Silas said softly. No. I lunged forward, but 2 massive council guards materialized from the shadows, grabbing me by the elbows. Silas, stop! You can't just quit. You spent your whole life building this. Escort the civilian off the premises, Silas commanded, turning his back to me completely. She has no business here. The guards dragged me backward. My heels dug violently into the carpet. Silas, don't do this! You stupid, self-sacrificing bureaucrat, look at me! The heavy, brass-studded oak doors swung open. I was hauled out into the freezing, sterile hallway. The last thing I saw before the doors slammed shut was Silas, standing entirely alone, unpinning the royal insignia from his lapel and dropping it onto the table. My apartment was exactly 62 degrees, smelled like depression, and was currently being assaulted by a torrential, deeply cliché downpour. It had been 6 hours since the council guards had dumped me on the sidewalk outside my building. I was aggressively trying to enjoy my hard-won, fiercely protected independence. I was wearing my oversized flannel shirt. I was sitting on my incredibly practical, highly affordable couch. I was eating sad, canned ravioli straight out of the saucepan. I had completely isolated myself from emotional vulnerability. I was entirely, fundamentally safe, and I wanted to throw myself out the window. This is fine, I announced out loud to my dying succulent on the windowsill. This is exactly what we wanted. A quiet, uncomplicated life with 0 billionaires getting punched in the face, it's logical. The succulent dropped a single shriveled leaf onto the floor in response. I aggressively stabbed a ravioli. The absolute silence of the apartment was suffocating. I kept waiting for the floorboards to creak. I kept waiting for a giant, intimidating man holding a yellow toolbox to walk through my door and completely fail at basic home maintenance. But Silas was gone. He had walked away to save me because I had practically begged him to in the kitchen. I had used my sharpest, most cynical logic to explain away the best thing that had ever happened to me, and the idiot had actually listened. My phone vibrated on the coffee table. I lunged for it, nearly upending the saucepan of pasta onto my rug. I practically cracked the screen unlocking it. It wasn't Silas. It was a text from an unknown number, but I recognized the terrifying, aggressive grammar immediately. Unknown. The king has relinquished his office. He is currently packing his desk. He did not raise his voice. He did not fight. He is handing the coalition to Vance. You broke his jaw, human, but this is considerably worse. I stared at the message from the head of security. The image of Silas, the man who commanded rooms without speaking, the man who stepped in front of camera flashes to shield me, the man who looked so profoundly exhausted by the weight of his world. Quietly putting his things into a cardboard box was like taking a physical blow to the stomach. He wasn't fighting because he thought he had nothing left to fight for. He thought I didn't want him. The ravioli pan hit the floor with a loud metallic clatter, splattering red sauce across my cheap rug. I didn't care. I stood up, my pulse suddenly hammering a frantic, wild rhythm against my ribs. I had spent 26 years building walls to make sure no one could ever leave me. But sitting in my perfect, isolated fortress, I realized something horrifying. A fortress is just a prison you build yourself. I looked at the yellow throw pillow sitting on my armchair, the one Silas had caught out of the air. I remembered the sheer, overwhelming heat of his hands on my face on the rooftop. I remembered the devastatingly calm way he had told the council he forfeited his life's work just to make sure I wouldn't go to jail. Why are you so terrified of being seen, Margot? Because I am an idiot, I whispered to the empty room. I wasn't terrified anymore. I was furiously, incandescently angry. Angry at Vance, angry at the archaic shifter legal system, and mostly, angry at myself for being a coward. I grabbed my heavy winter coat off the hook by the door. I didn't bother changing out of my flannel shirt or my ripped jeans. I didn't care that my hair was a chaotic mess. I shoved my feet into my rain boots and ripped the front door open, sprinting down the hallway. If Lord Vance thought he could steal the coalition using my red pen, he was about to get a crash course in tort law, emotional damages, and what happens when an aggressively practical overthinker finally loses her mind. I hailed a cab in the pouring rain, slamming the door shut. National Shifter Council Headquarters, I barked at the driver, rainwater dripping down my nose. And step on it. I have to go yell at a king. The rain was coming down in sheets by the time the cab skidded to a halt in front of the brutalist concrete slab that was the Shifter Council headquarters. I didn't wait for the driver to hand me my receipt. I shoved a crumpled $50 bill through the partition, threw open the door, and marched directly into the deluge. My boots squeaked aggressively on the polished granite floors of the lobby. The two massive security guards from earlier immediately stepped into my path, their arms crossing in terrifying synchronization. "Civilian," the larger one rumbled, towering over my soaked flannel shirt. "You are permanently barred from this. If you finish that sentence, I will sue you for unlawful detainment, emotional distress, and I will personally audit your pension fund," I shouted, completely unhinged. I didn't stop walking. I pointed a wet, trembling finger directly at his nose. "I am actively having an emotional breakthrough. Do not ruin my character arc." The sheer, absolute audacity of a soaking wet, human woman yelling at them caused a fatal system error in their security protocol. They hesitated for a fraction of a second, and I slipped right between them. I threw my entire body weight against the heavy, brass-studded oak doors of the council room. They burst open with a dramatic, thunderous bang that echoed off the high concrete ceilings. The 12 council members froze, their heads snapping toward me in unison. Silas was standing at the far end of the long mahogany table. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His tie was gone, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone, revealing the exhausted line of his collarbone. He was holding a cardboard box. He had actually been packing his desk. When he saw me, the cardboard box slipped from his hands, hitting the polished wood with a dull thud. "What is the meaning of this?" Lord Vance shrieked, half rising from his newly claimed seat of power. "Guards, remove this hysterical human." "Sit down, Vance, before I line edit your face," I snapped, marching straight down the length of the table. I didn't look at the counsel. I only looked at Silas. As I closed the distance, the suffocating scent of ozone in the room vanished, completely overpowered by the clean, sharp scent of his bergamot cologne. He looked entirely wrecked, his dark eyes wide, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths, as if I were a hallucination he was terrified to wake up from. I stopped mere inches from him, forcing him to look down at my dripping wet hair and ruined flannel. "You are an idiot," I breathed, my voice shaking terribly in the quiet room. "You are an overworking, emotionally stunted, tragically self-sacrificing idiot." "Margot," he rasped, his voice a gravelly, raw whisper. His hands twitched at his sides, fighting the physical urge to reach out and pull me in. "I am terrified of being seen," I confessed, saying the words out loud for the first time in my life. The vulnerability felt like swallowing glass, but I didn't look away from his dark eyes. "I am terrified that if I stop fighting, everyone will leave, so I built walls. I used sarcasm. I broke your jaw." A tiny, breathless sound escaped his throat. "But you stayed," I continued, stepping even closer. The heat radiating off his broad chest was a physical anchor in the freezing room. "You let me roast your terrible furniture, you caught my yellow pillow, you gave up your entire life's work just to keep me safe. I don't care about the contract, Silas. I don't care about the council. I claim you." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. "Preposterous," Vance scoffed, slamming his fist on the table. "You have no legal standing. The contract is voided. Silas has surrendered his crown." Silas finally moved. He didn't acknowledge Vance. He didn't look at the counsel. He simply reached out, his massive, warm hands sliding into my damp hair, cupping my face with a desperate, crushing tenderness. His thumbs brushed over my cheekbones, wiping away a mix of rainwater and tears I hadn't realized I was crying. "I don't have a crown anymore," Silas murmured, his breath ghosting over my lips. The exhaustion in his eyes was entirely gone, replaced by a fierce, undeniable light. "I am just a man. I have nothing left to offer you but myself." "That's all I ever wanted, you bureaucratic nightmare," I whispered. Silas smiled, a real, devastatingly bright smile that completely transformed his face. He leaned down and kissed me right there in front of the entire ruling elite. It wasn't rushed or frantic. It was a slow, deliberate, incredibly thorough claiming that completely dissolved the remaining tension in my body. My hands tangled in the front of his shirt, anchoring myself to him as the room around us ceased to exist. When he finally pulled back, he kept his forehead rested against mine. He turned his head just enough to look at the sputtering counsel. "Keep the desk, Vance," Silas said, his voice ringing with absolute, liberated authority. "I highly recommend investing in a yellow throw pillow. The acoustics in here are terrible." He laced his fingers through mine, the sheer size of his hand completely engulfing my own. We turned our backs on the most powerful shifters in the city and walked out of the heavy oak doors, leaving absolute silence in our wake. The rain had stopped by the time we reached the sidewalk. The city neon reflected in the puddles, casting a warm glow over the concrete. Silas stopped, pulling me gently against his chest. The power imbalance was completely gone. He wasn't a king, and I wasn't a hostage. We were just two terrifyingly flawed people who had finally figured it out. He looked down at me, his eyes crinkling with that dry, deadpan humor I had come to love. "So," Silas murmured, his thumb tracing my jawline, "just to be entirely clear on the parameters of this new arrangement, are you going to punch me again? I laughed, reaching up to pull him back down for another kiss. Only if you try to make me drink oat milk.